Okay, so here I want to show you how I would go about doing bubbles inside of Maya. I'll create this sphere, I'll set it to emit from object, I'll select the object and I'll add a keyframe. The first frame, maybe another keyframe at frame 60. So we have something like that. So you can see we have our sphere, which has the emitter inside, the particles below that, and then we have our nucleus. Nucleus is like God, it controls things like gravity. So we'll go there first and set the gravity to 1 instead of -1, which would make everything go up. We'll go into our emitter, and I'll set this to 40 particles a second. I'll add a keyframe, go to frame 25, set key and set it to 0. So we'll just have a burst of bubbles. I'll offset that a little bit so we get something like that. Okay, I'll select the emitter and I'll bring the speed down a bit. And I'll bring up the speed random. I'll select those particles. I'll set a random range of 4 to like 0.4. I'll select the particles again and I'll go to fields, turbulence. I'll bring the attenuation to 0 and the magnitude to 34, which will probably be too high, yeah. So I'll bring that down a lot. That'll probably be too high still. So you want the attenuation set to 0. That's kind of like the fall off. So that looks better. Okay. We could select that again, go to fields, go to drag, and bring the attenuation just so just a little bit of drag as they come up. You can see that's too much. That looks better. Okay. Let's go to turbulence field and set it to 6. Bring it up just a little bit. And that's good. So I'm going to go to create V-Ray. V-Ray, create V-Ray metaballs, and it has this odd shaped geometry. We'll select the particles, go to general, radius PP, create expression. We'll grab this down here and drag it down. So that's your particle shape name, radius per particle. We'll go to rand, and then we'll put 0.01 comma to 0.1, and we'll close the expression. Okay. And we'll go to per particle attribute export and point size. Scroll down to the bottom, point size PP, point size from radius. Now we'll select our V-Ray metaball. We'll click Edit Particle System and select Particle System P and then select the particle on the right hand side. If you play that, still not going to see anything. We have to go back into the metal ball, go to use particle size, turn on show preview, increase the resolution, crank up the max particles and max phase, and there you could start seeing real geometry emitting from the surface. As we bring up our step and threshold, you can see they start merging with each other sooner. Now you do run out of preview preview geometry here. It'll hit a max and then it'll stop previewing it, but it'll still render as many as needed. So let's add a new material, V-Ray material. We'll set the color to black, reflection all the way. I always set the glossiness to 0.9 if I want something to be super reflective. Refraction all the way up. I'll add a dome light, use dome texture, multiply by light color, load up a file texture, load up an HDR. There we go. I will select the dome light, go to my options, turn off visibility, and I'm going to turn off effect diffuse. So you can see how nice that looks. Extremely quick, very simple to do. It'll only look better if you put motion blur. It does not have motion blur right now, so it looks a little crystally, but with motion blur it'll look better. You can go in there and change the min and max value if you want more variation. We just have to play it back. You could see the IPR is fast enough to show you a preview as you're playing. You know, you could spend obviously more time playing with the turbulence, the speed, and other sorts of fields. So we'll export out our passes, reflection, specular, refraction, and we'll kick that off to render. Okay, so back in Nuke, we plugged that in already. So let's go in and put some other elements in here. So I did a commercial a while back. It was shot entirely underwater. You could see that on my Vimeo page. And at the end of the shoot, I asked them to bring in a black piece of fabric and just shoot underwater bubbles and particulate. So this is what I have here. It's real bubbles, real underwater particulate. It's thousands of frames long. I let it just roll and roll and roll. And the only downfall is you could still kind of feel the fabric in the back. So we'll add a grade node and just crunch the blacks a little bit to get rid of some of the cloth in the background. So you could see we just get rid of that. So we're just keeping the highlights. We could bring up the gain, or we could tint the gain slightly. So it gives it more blue highlight. So when we put that in, since this was shot with the red, I think it was the dragon, resolution is much higher. So we'll add a transform node and scale this down a bit. Scaled it down to 0.45, and that's great. So it just gives it some realism and some more complexity. I always try to blend in as much live action particles, dust, whatever. Okay. So next up is our hero. So we have our diver. Let's plug him in. So you can see the bubbles line up fine. Let's just start shuffling out some of these passes. So this is stuff we already gone through before, but you could see it on the diver. And it's add for each one of these, which in Nuke is plus or add. So I'm just bringing down some of the settings a bit, the opacity. So it's better to do the look dev with a little bit more spec than you actually need it, and then be able to dial it down. So the problem when I played the previous render of the diver, it just didn't feel natural. There's something very CG about the window. You could see that it just felt really contrived. It felt very video gamey. So we did a 3D scan of the actor using a Kinect, an Xbox Kinect, or you could do it now with the new iPhones with this program called Capture, and it'll give you an OBJ, and we did a very quick cleanup and texture job, and we just rendered the guy inside. We just sculpted the hair. It wasn't real hair, but when you see it, it just feels so much more realistic. Now you can see I'm using a multi-matte pass, my red pass, which I rendered separately in this case, to mask out the new refraction pass, basically what we're seeing through the glass. So I didn't have to re-render everything, I just re-rendered the stuff in the glass. Okay. And the reason why we're doing this roto node is to wipe out the old refraction in the portholes and just use the chest piece. So I'm just going every 30-40 frames and just positioning the roto, and then going in the frames between that and just getting it as loose as possible, not taking too much time. So now when we see that when we merge this all together, it comps in a little bit better. Okay. I'm gonna bring up the multiply on this a bit. Let's just see what that looks like. So something got messed up here. One of them just needs to be set to RGB. The alpha got messed up somewhere, so we have to track it down. So you can see that alpha looks odd there. You can see the alpha there looks weird. So let's set this to RGB, and that should fix it. Let's just set the first one to RGB. The first one, I mean the first shuffle, and that fixed that. You know, sometimes things go wrong. The issue I've always had with tutorials like this is they give a false impression of everything going right the first time, and the truth is, when I'm doing this the first time, I tried 1,000 different things and all of them looked terrible until I found the right way, and now I'm showing you the right way, but that's not the way it really is. You know, it takes a lot of experimentation and messing around until something looks right. So here I'm shuffling out the refraction pass, and I'm really cranking up the gain and the multiply. I'm going completely overboard with it, and I'll show you why. I'm going to go and add a glow node here. I will bring up the size. I'll turn on effect only. So remember, effect only just means get rid of the input image and only show me the result or the effect. So then you have to merge that back on, and I'll set this to plus. So you can see it gives a little bit of a glow around the portholes. So now I'm going to do something similar to what we did with the terrain in the background, how we're doing a series of glow nodes to give it a murkiness. And again, I know I said this before, just make sure that you apply the glow node on all the glow nodes you add to the node before the first glow node in that sequence of glow nodes. So in this case, merge 26. You would never go to merge 27 because then it would be adding a glow on top of a glow, which we don't want. Another thing, you could see that I rotoed out the chest light because that's too bright, and we're gonna have so much glow coming from that later down the pipe that I don't want to blow that out at this moment. So I'm gonna set all of these to plus. So you can see they're all connected in this example to the roto node, because that's what's cutting out the port light in the chest. Looking pretty cool. Set that to plus. I'll bring the mix amount down a bit, and then we'll merge that back on. So you can see, for one, our bounding box is way too big, so we have to adjust that. But the big thing, of course, is that the grade is completely off. It doesn't feel like it belongs in the shot at all. So we'll set our unpre-multiply to RGB alpha. That will make sure it only affects that input and not the layers below it. And then using my lift, I'm going to sample a value, one of the dark values in the back, and then using either the slider, which is on my other monitor, or typing it in with your input, darkening this just a bit. But by you sampling that background hue or that background color to begin with, you're already in the right temperature. So now you just have to bring that value slider down, in this case, to darken it, because you don't want it to be the exact value as the stuff in the back. As things get closer to camera, they have more contrast. So we need to add that contrast because he's much closer. But at least we know that the temperature is going to be correct. So here we've pulled the porthole again. We've shuffled out just the windows. So the refraction, we added another grade node, completely overcranked it like we did before. And we're going to go to filter, volume raise. Volume raise we've already talked about. So you can see I'm a big fan of this effect, as long as you use it properly. So you can see right there, it's very strong. It feels like the poster for The Thing. I'm going to adjust my pre-ray blur. I will adjust my ray length. My volume gain. And I'm going to copy the original render of the diver, bring it down here just for reference, and completely bring up the brightness of the image. Now I'm going to eyeball this, and I'm going to place that vol position in the cross section of the bar that goes across the helmet and the middle seam on the helmet. And I'm going to go every few frames, grab that point and place it in the cross section. You can see there's like an X or a T right in the middle. And I'm going to go every few frames and just make sure that lines up. It's not as bad as it seems. You could say, why wouldn't you just do this in 3D? It's much easier to be automated, because this probably took me a whole 5-10 minutes to do. Rendering 150 frames, even if it takes a minute a frame, is 150 minutes. So you can see, since the light inside the helmet dims down and then brightens up, it's dynamically adding those rays, which just look great. Merge that back on there, set this to plus, and make it super subtle. I want to feel the rays, not see them. So let's look at our we'll go to an edge blur. And something looks funky in those edges. If I look at my alpha, something just looks off. So my alpha got weirded out somewhere. So let's figure it out. By setting the glow node to RGBA instead of just RGB, everything was fixed. And then I'll go over here and I'll set the blending modes to screen. And there you go. My edges now look correct, which is what I wanted. So let's go and add a light wrap. Light wrap is very important if you want to give the illusion of the light from behind wrapping around an object or a character on a layer in the foreground. So here we're increasing our diffuse and our intensity just to see what that looks like. So you can see it blends it in a little better. So he feels pretty good in there. Let's set our bounding boxes all to B. I like that. Let's close all our properties. Okay, so let's just go in and organize a bit. Just add a background node. Place everything inside of this. Let's label it. Give it a color. So let's go in, and I want to create the illusion the diver's looking inside of a small cave. So I found this image online, and I'm adding the keyer node, which is essentially a luminance keyer, meaning it'll look at the brightness, and based on that it'll pull a key. And on the left and right, it'll control how much of the black or the whites mask out. It's almost like adjusting your levels in Photoshop. So you can see if I go into my alpha here, we can see what it's doing. You're not going to see the effect until we put a pre-molt. So we'll put a pre-molt. We'll add a grade node, and let's just desaturate this a bit. Actually, I desaturated it all the way. I think I come back and add more saturation later. We'll do a horizontal flip. We'll add a transform node to position it. And let's just merge it and see what we get. Now, I always try to have a foreground, a midground, and a background. So this is supposed to obviously be the foreground. It will be extremely out of focus, so I don't care if I scale this up, which is a no-no if you want something in focus, but if you're going to defocus it, it'll be fine. So I'm just trying to find the right position for it. That feels pretty good. So let's move this over. Now we have to add a grade node to make this all feel connected. Let's move this over. Again, we'll select the lift. We'll select the darkest value in the back. You have to put unpremultiply by RGBA, and then we'll select the values on the diver since he's closer to the cave, and then we'll manually darken it just a bit more. I'm going to erode the edges a little bit. So you can see it just reads very graphical at this point. Let's adjust our levels a bit more. And then we'll go to filter defocus. And we'll crank this up. That looks better. I do think the pre-molt wiped out too much information, so we might go back in later and address this. We'll roto out that corner. And we'll go on. So next thing here is we want to create a lens flare shooting out of the chest piece. For this we're using optical flares. It's a plugin by Video Copilot. It's a great plugin. Nuke does have a lens flare filter, but it's a pain in the ass. This is extremely intuitive. So I just selected one of the presets, and then I could go into the individual elements and increase or decrease the brightness. I can hide or solo the individual elements. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just looking at some of the elements and seeing their effect. I could change what sort of texture, if anything, appears on the lens glass. That's will only be visible as very bright light hits it. We could add some chromatic aberration, which is the misalignment of your RGB channels. And I'm going to go in here and start dialing all this in. Now we have to set the center position. You can press the init center, which will find the midpoint of your frame. That's probably what we should do to be physically accurate, but I'm going to offset it just a little bit to get more of an art directed look. Okay, and we could go to our position, set key. We could also set a key on our center position. I ended up breaking those keyframes later for the center position and only animating position X and Y, which is what you should probably do as well. So you can see we're kind of doing the same thing we've done a few times already, just going in every 30-40 frames, placing your keyframes, then going back in between those keyframes and positioning more keyframes to get it to fill in all the in-between frames. So you can see that's looking pretty nice. Okay. If you notice, when I was adjusting my optical flares, I was doing it on the original read node of my CG render. I wasn't doing it on the comp. And the reason is I don't want to have to bring in all that weight while I'm just setting up the optical flares. I'll just bring in just the EXR, plug it into that, because I'm only worried about the position. That's it. I don't care about how it looks in the comp. Once I get the position out of the way, then I could go in and replug it into the comp and dial it in. So I'm copying that roto for the chest light. I'll go to my filters and I'm going to go back to my volume raise. And I'm going to position this slightly behind it or to the left of it and try to fake the light shooting out of the chest. So you can see that looks very strong, but we'll dial this all in. So I already have the values that have worked for me before, so I'll just plug those in. You'll see that sometimes my settings are really overcranked, and then I rely a lot on my mix node to blend it back in. So you might see some of this stuff and be like, wow, you're overcranking this. But when I go in and I dial it in the mix node, it ends up being much less visible. And now we're going to set the key and do what we've done a bunch of times. Go every couple frames and animate it. I already have this animated, so we don't have to go in and do that. Here you can see what I mean by it looking way too bright. Then I bring in my mix and I drop it down, and it all looks good. So whatever works. If I play that now, you can see that's looking pretty good. So let's add a foreground element. This is another piece of rock I pulled off the internet. I just created a really rough alpha around it. Like everything we do, it'll never look good until we add our lovely grade node. So we'll go into our gain. Start bringing that up. And let's set our unpre-multiply by RGB alpha. I want to darken it a little bit more. There's a level of detail on that rock that I would like to have on the top as well. I'll scale this up a little bit. You can see I repositioned the pivot so that it scales from where I want it to. We'll defocus this. So you can see we're not doing any sort of Z defocus. We're just doing a very simple defocus. And we'll just crank this up. Trying to get the top to feel closer to the bottom. There's just not enough information there, so I'm gonna have to go and revisit this. Sometimes you just have to type it in. So let's set our bounding box and let's move on for now. So I want to defocus the background a little bit. You can see all the work we did back there, and it's pretty much not even visible. You feel it though, and that's what's important. And now we'll go in and defocus it a bit. Keep it very low, like a 1.1. I just want to take the CG edge off. So next thing, I want to create more particles. I want to put these more in the foreground. So I'll show you a workflow for this. The other thing is I want it to appear as if the light coming out of his chest is illuminating these particles. So let's do this. So this is the same particles we've used all over the place. I'm going to create a constant, 2496 by 1248, I believe. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to merge that particle texture or particle sequence onto this constant. And I'm going to scale it down and have it take up a quarter of the image. Duplicate it a bunch of times to make up one large image that has very small particulate. So this is just a series of merge nodes and transform nodes, nothing complex. So I'll speed through this, but you get the idea. Essentially, we're making an uber large tileable like texture. So here you can see we've merged it back on. You can see the particulate size is much smaller, which I really like. What we'll do here is add a grade node and do the same similar technique that we used up above with the background particulate, where we made it seem like the light from the side was illuminating it, but we're going to make it appear as if the light from his chest is illuminating the particles. So we'll crank up the grade node, we'll set the mask to RGB red. So you can see that now only the particles that are being hit by the light are being illuminated. We could add a grade node to them and slightly make them yellow so it feels like they're being illuminated by the same light source. It's very subtle, but it ties everything together. So you can see when I turn it on and off. Just trying to find a perfect balance by adjusting the black point and white point of my grade node that again is overly cranked to act as a mask. That's not the final image that we're applying. We're just using that as a mask. I also want to grab that same tile of particles and possibly place it, a copy of it, higher up the chain. just to give it more particles. And we'll clean this up a bit. We'll lower the opacity, the mix. Again, I don't want to see it, I want to feel it, just very, very subtle. Let's set our bounding box to be So let's add a soften node at the end just to kind of unify everything. I add a soften node on everything. I don't like CG being too sharp. I'm going to grab the live action particulate, place it really close to the camera. So it has to be after the foreground rocks. I'll copy the grade node that I applied on it earlier, where we got rid of the background fabric. And I'm going to add a constant here and merge this onto a black constant. The reason you'll see in a second. So the reason why I add a constant and merge the live action particles to the constant is so when I add a defocus node after the constant, it'll only process that size resolution instead of the 6, 7, 8K red footage that the source material carries. So it'll be much faster to process. And let's play it. So you can see I've lowered the lens flare a little bit. Those foreground bubbles are still getting in the way. I still want to darken those. So we'll go to that frame, add the grade node, and I'll copy the roto from above and use that as the mask for the grade. So you can see that looks much better. Let's play that again. You can see the bubbles start getting darker. Looking good.